Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and thank you for joining me for another deep dive into the life and times of infamous serial killer Dennis Nilsen. In part 1, I don't know, man, there's way too many creepy fantasies and grim justifications made by Dennis Nilsen for why he became what he became, to even recap. So if you haven't seen the first video yet, you should watch that before you watch this because 1 comes before 2, and as you by now know, in order to understand what happened at the end, we have to go back to the beginning. Today we are following Dennis Nilsen to London, the place he fled to after leaving the military with the hopes that civilian life would be more open and accepting of a man such as himself. But before we dive in, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark VPN. Surfshark is a modern VPN designed with the user in mind. Their utilities are powered by robust security mechanisms, but they're designed to be simple and intuitive to use. And listen, I've used a lot of VPNs in my time, and as someone who's very technologically challenged, I can tell you that Surfshark is by far the easiest to navigate, and their interface is the most intuitive to use. Surfshark VPN is a solid and feature-packed service that is far beyond other VPNs in my opinion, especially when it comes to speed, security, and features. And if you're not using a VPN, you really should be. Surfshark encrypts all the data sent via the internet, protecting your passwords, private messages, photos, videos, and other sensitive data from prying eyes. With Surfshark's camouflage mode, you can stay private. Even your internet provider can't tell that you're using a VPN, which means that they cannot throttle your speed while streaming or gaming, which they have been known to do. It also keeps you hidden from advertisers, the ones who watch everything you're doing online so they can hit you with targeted ads. If you've ever wondered why it seems like Facebook can read your mind, almost like they knew you were shopping for the new Oculus VR headset, and now every time you sign into Facebook, you see an ad for the new Oculus, and you're like, what? Oh my God, thank you, Facebook, for anticipating my needs. No, they aren't reading your mind. They're just stalking you. They're stalking you online. If you turn on Surfshark's clean web feature, you can surf in a cyber ocean with no ads, trackers, malware, or phishing attempts. And let me tell you, it is nice. My favorite Surfshark VPN feature, however, is open borders mode. I'm sure you've run into this before. You're trying to watch a YouTube video and then you get this message and it's like sad face, this like sad TV face, and it's like, sorry, this content isn't available in your country. This is called geo-blocking, where certain websites, because they know your location, they block you from different areas of the internet. And it sucks, man. Surfshark believes the internet should be open for everyone, so they give you the ability to change your virtual location. This way you can access all your favorite content no matter where you are. I use this feature every time I want to watch a college basketball game that's been blacked out in my area for whatever reason, or when I want to watch a new season of a show that hasn't been released in the US yet, and I love it. Surfshark VPN has the ease of use, the value, and the features, and right now for a limited time you can get 83% off a 2-year plan and 4 extra months for free at surfshark.deals/stephanieharlowe. This special offer makes your subscription just $2.21 a month well worth it. And you can use Surfshark VPN on unlimited devices, your phone, your laptop, your tablets, your computer, your desktop, your mom's computer, your husband's phone, your kids' tablets. It's amazing. Once again, go to surfshark.deals/stephanieharlowe to get 83% off a 2-year plan plus 4 extra months for free. And there's an E on the end of Stephanie and Harlowe. Thank you so much to Surfshark for sponsoring this video, and let's dive back in. The dogs are barking upstairs, and I'm alone in the house. So what are they barking at? Is there an intruder? If there is an intruder, would I be safer in my recording booth/panic room? They've stopped barking. That could be a good thing or a bad thing. Nope, they're barking again. At least I know they're alive. Let me go check it out because this is going to annoy me. If I don't come back, you would never know because I haven't put this on YouTube. Okay, I'm back. I didn't see anyone up there. There could be someone up there, but I just yelled, is there someone here to kill me? And if so, can you just get it over with and do it quick so I don't have to hear my dogs bark for an hour? because that's real torture. Okay, so when Dennis Nilsen left the military, he was 1 month away from turning 27, and he'd been in the Army for 11 years, leaving with the rank of a decorated corporal. According to his service records, Nilsen's conduct during his time in the Army had been exemplary, but his fellow recruits found him to be odd and strange. It's easy for Nilsen's superiors to say he's like this amazing guy because all they care about is that he hasn't caused them any trouble. He keeps to himself, doesn't cause problems. But the recruits, the people who have to live with him, they're like, you don't know how really out there this dude is. A man named Eric Talbot joined the Army on the same day as Dennis Nilsen. And Eric said, quote, "He was a quiet chap, a bit sheepish. He kept to himself, really. He wasn't a great mixer. He didn't get stuck into sports like most of us did. I never saw him playing football, hockey, or getting involved with boxing. He had a weird sense of humor, totally different to everyone else's sense of humor. We couldn't work him out. I remember a mate of mine saying to him, 'You're bloody weird, you are,' end quote." Talbot also remembered taking a trip to London during their initial Army training to visit the War Museum and the National Gallery, but one day they went to Madame Tussauds, and Dennis Nilsen insisted on visiting the Chamber of Horrors. So Madame Tussauds is a wax museum, a famous wax museum, and he wanted to go to the Chamber of Horrors, and there on display was the actual bathtub that John Hay, the acid bath killer, had used in his murders. Apparently, Dennis Nilsen had a thing for darkness and horror, and he was known to read horror stories and enjoy horror films, which we did talk about briefly in part 1. He really liked Psycho. Eric Talbot said that on Friday and Saturday nights, Dennis would go out wearing all black and a black cape, which was strange, and no one knew what he was doing while he was out dressed like the Phantom of the Opera. At Madame Tussauds' Chamber of Horrors, Dennis Nilsen stepped over the velvet ropes that had been placed around John Hay's bathtub, and he settled himself into the tub, causing their whole group to get kicked out of the museum, and Dennis thought this was hysterical because he's that guy. However, let's not judge him too harshly for this, because I feel like this is something I might do, and I want to pretend it's completely normal, because I think there's at least a 28% chance that I would do this, especially if I thought I wasn't going to get caught. But yeah. According to Dennis himself, one of the main reasons he walked away after spending almost half of his life in the Army was because he was growing uncomfortable being on the side of the oppressors, and he didn't want to be a contract killer for the British Army, which is ironic for us in hindsight because he would go on to kill several people without mercy. But here is the caveat, the way he reconciled this in his mind. It wasn't so much that he was against killing, it was that he was opposed to killing on the orders of someone else. Dennis Nilsen felt he was an intelligent man, far more intelligent than anyone he worked with or any of his superior officers, so why should he take life just because someone had told him to? Something Dennis did learn during his time as an Army cook was the art of butchery, a skill he would use often during his later life and crimes. During his time in the Army, Nilsen had also come to terms with his sexuality. When he had been a young boy, he'd often wondered why he felt so drawn to other young boys and why he would fantasize about them. He eventually realized that he was a gay man, and this, I guess, initially took a toll on him because being gay wasn't acceptable in the country he had been born in, Scotland. And it also wasn't something that was openly talked about in the military at this time, so he was constantly feeling as if he had to hide who he truly was. According to Eric Talbot, however, no one suspected that Dennis wasn't exactly what he claimed to be, an odd, heterosexual man who went to church every Sunday, making sure to spend extra time at the end for additional prayers. Dennis was also an annoying rule follower, at least when it came to orders given by his Army superiors. I guess his adversity to following orders came later, or he just liked feeling superior to his fellow soldier, or he just ignores rules when he goes to Madame Tussauds Wax Museum because that velvet rope around the bathtub would be the one thing that would prevent me from getting into that bathtub, because I am also annoyingly a rule follower. I do not jaywalk. It's more likely that Dennis probably just wanted everyone to think he was a rule follower, that he was on the straight and narrow. So the rest of the men in his unit, they wore elastic waisted trousers, even though it was forbidden, strictly forbidden. but Dennis refused to do so because it was against the rules. Talbot said, quote, "If the sergeant said jump, he would say, 'How high?' We were always trying to beat the system, but not him in the slightest. He was a goody-goody." End quote. Remember back in the day when you would call someone a goody-goody and that was an insult? It was like a sick burn. You're goody-goody. Ugh, teacher's pet. So what we have here is we have Dennis Nilsen. He's an ass kisser with his superiors. He's neutral with his equals, but with his juniors, he was known to be a bit of a bully. He was notorious for smacking the younger recruits on their backsides with a cane that he carried around. It was in the Army that Nilsen began his love affair with alcohol, a substance that would help bring his lurid fantasies to life in his brain. After leaving the Army, Dennis spent 5 weeks back home in Stricken, taking that time to remember how much he hated the place and everyone in it, and making plans for what would come next. By this time, Dennis's older brother Olav was married and living with his wife in Fraserburg, and Dennis paid the couple a visit where they all watched a movie called Victim, in which the main character, who is a married man, has to admit to his wife that he's having an affair with another man. Now, this film was considered cutting edge at this time, sort of like an indie, one of those scandalous films, kind of like Brokeback Mountain was when it came out. When did it come out? 2012? I don't know, but sort of like that, though. It caused a buzz, and the buzz kind of made people want to watch it to find out for themselves what all the hubbub was about. So Dennis, as a gay man, is watching this with his brother, who is heterosexual, and his brother's wife, who is also heterosexual, and they were commenting on how disgusting the whole thing was. And understandably, this infuriated Dennis, who took their disgust personally. Once again, understandably. So he got mad and he left after the movie, and later that evening, Dennis and his brother Olav exchanged angry words at the station hotel where they had gone to grab some drinks, and Dennis ended up getting punched in the face, and he never spoke to his brother again, saying, quote, "He represented everything that existed to put me down," end quote. I mean, it also could be that Olav was just genuinely upset that his brother used to molest him under the covers at night. And maybe that was a traumatic triggering experience for him. But okay, Dennis. Okay, let's make you the victim here. While he was in Stricken, he stayed at his mother's house, and Dennis would lock himself in his room listening to music and writing poetry, according to Betty, his mother. I hope he didn't have a mirror in that room, because if he did, we know what he was really doing. All right? And it wasn't writing poetry. During the several weeks he spent at home, Dennis basically shut himself in, didn't talk to anyone, and scribbled stanzas and verses in a notebook while blasting classical music and getting shit-faced. Dennis left Stricken in December of 1972 and traveled to London, where he stayed at the Chevron Club in Dorset. This is a place that was designed for members of the armed forces, both commissioned and non-commissioned, so I feel like it was sort of a VA, a place where members of the military could go to socialize, live, eat, or drink. Obviously, as a civilian now, having spent basically half his life in the Army, Dennis is going to have to figure out what is next. But here's what confuses me when it comes to his civilian life career choice. He claimed he had left the Army because he didn't want to take orders, and he didn't agree with the morals of the military, and he didn't want to be on the side of the oppressors. But then he decides to go to London, and then once in London, he decides he wants to be a police officer, which feels pretty much like the same plot, right? Same job, just with a different name. You got a group of armed, uniformed people focused on law and order who get to tell people what to do and, enforce the laws. So I'm not sure how much Dennis really was adverse to being on the side of the oppressors. I think Dennis liked positions where he could control others, where he could simply get up in the morning, get dressed, and then garner respect just because he had a uniform and a badge on. It was easier for him than having to earn the respect of others, because he felt that if he had to earn the respect of others, he would never get it. But if he didn't have to earn it, if it was just a given based on the fact that he was a police officer or in the Army, it was much easier for him. Almost immediately, Dennis got an interview with the Metropolitan Police at the Recruitment Center in Paddington Green Police Station. Now, according to Dennis, he felt that being a police officer was the most logical step after leaving Army life. It was an easy transition between being a soldier and a civilian. After 16 weeks of training, Nilsen was assigned to Q Division. Now, we aren't going to talk a lot about this time on the police force because, one, it was short-lived, and two, this series cannot be a trillion parts. But I will point out that I believe his choice to join the Metropolitan Police was more about his desire to still remain in a position of authority, even though he will later claim that the offenses committed by the London police disgusted him and his progressive sensibilities. Dennis Nilsen does a lot of virtue signaling about how he saw his colleagues do horrible things and treat citizens with derision or violence, but he never did any of this because he was better than that. And I'm not saying that cops treating citizens with derision or violence is a good thing, but I'm saying, should you throw stones? Dennis Nilsen, should you? Nilsen did say his favorite thing about being an officer of the law was the communal showers they would all take after training sessions, where he would sneak glances at the other young men and imagine and pretend that they were sneaking glances at him as well. For his final training test before he was sworn in, Dennis had to rescue someone who was drowning, and he was assigned a young man to save. Remembering this moment, Dennis said, quote, "The whole operation had me buzzing with extenuating excitement, getting him out of the water and on the tiled floor, then giving him artificial respiration sparked within me a throbbing tension, as you can well imagine. I thrilled at the power and control that I had to lavish my strong but gentle attentions on this beautifully passive young man. I now fully accepted the fact that the main inheritance of my life was an ingrained sexual perversion which thrived on passive male bodies." End quote. Now remember from the video we did about what a serial killer is and why they do the things they do? Experts have theorized that a move from more rural areas to more crowded and industrialized areas would leave certain people, a certain personality, feeling disconnected from humanity and society. In London, Dennis Nilsen certainly felt this. According to author Brian Masters, who wrote the book Killing for Company, Dennis Nilsen was, quote, "disappointed not to find the same kind of camaraderie in the police force as he had been used to in the army, a consequence of anonymous London life. The big cosmopolitan city did not line up friends for you to choose from. You had to ferret them out. Nilsen knew no one in London and began to feel the awkwardness of isolation in a crowd, a sensation that would deepen as the years progressed." End quote. Dennis Nilsen's solution to this loneliness was to explore his local pubs and bars, and during his adventures, he discovered that there was an entire subculture in London specifically for men like himself. He said, quote, "I'd heard from police training that gay people would hang around in the Earl's Court district of London." End quote. Now, these places were not anything like the establishments of today, where anyone who identifies as LGBTQ can go to drink and dance, dress how they want, showing themselves to the world loudly and proudly. These were like dark and seedy establishments, filled with men who were prowling for a quick fix before returning home to their wives and children, continuing on the charade until they could slip away again. And this is where Dennis Nilsen found himself, prowling for victims. Now, there's one story I want to tell you from Nilsen's time with the police force, and I call it the creepy morgue story. And in this case, it's not the morgue that makes the story creepy, but Dennis Nilsen himself. So you know when there's a morgue involved, and it's not the creepiest thing about the story, it's bad. So Nilsen had been assigned a mentor, an older man on the police force who was intended to show him the ropes, and this man's name was Pete Wellstead. And he liked Dennis Nilsen fine enough, but he described this sense of dissatisfaction that clung to his new recruit like a second skin. One day, Pete took Dennis and another recruit to the Brent mortuary. The other recruit grew pale as soon as he saw the bodies laid out, ready to be cut into and autopsied, but Dennis was not fazed. He said, quote, "I had trained and qualified as a butcher. I could dissect a carcass of mutton down into its component joints in less than 20 minutes, end quote. Humble brag. Dennis claims what did bother him, however, was the way the mortuary attendant had treated the bodies with no respect, as if they were commodities, dead meat to be processed. Faced with these bodies, Dennis noticed two in particular: an old man who had been opened from neck to navel, a vision that he claims generated a hot friction inside of him, and on the trolley next to this old man lay the body of a naked 5-year-old girl who had been killed in, I believe it was a train accident. Now, Dennis claims he saw the mortuary attendant grab this girl's wrist and let it drop onto her trolley again. And Dennis Nilsen said, quote, What produced a surge of sexual excitement in me was that when he released her wrist, he let it flap limply against the naked thigh of the old man on the next trolley. It was for me a very potent image. It was the invigorating contrast between the gutted, wasted, hairy old nakedness and ugliness of the man against the pure, young, new virginal softness and beauty of her small hand laying on, of all places, his naked thigh." End quote. So, listen, it really doesn't matter which way you slice this banana cream pie. Dennis Nilsen was twisted. And I know there's going to be people out there, because there's contrarians everywhere, who are like, he got messed up, or he was dealt a bad hand in life. Dude's twisted. Most normal people, even your run-of-the-mill violent criminals that pack the prisons around this country, would have taken in that scene and felt disgusted. But Dennis Nilsen was excited by it. After that day, Dennis had a new fantasy to add to his repertoire. He imagined the morgue attendant sneaking into the morgue on his lunch break and sexually assaulting the girl's dead body. The 5-year-old girl. That was Dennis Nilsen's fantasy. Okay, so Dennis Nilsen is walking the streets as a London police officer during the day, and he's going, to gay bars and things at night. And while going from bar to bar, Dennis did meet men, and sometimes they would go back to Dennis's place, they would undress, touch each other, and fall asleep. But Dennis claims he did not have sex with most of these men because he was sort of experimenting and easing into his new life. One of the men he did take to bed was named Paul. This was a man who looked 16, but he was actually in his 20s. Dennis said that Paul was pale and slim with long silken hair, and he reminded Dennis of his sister, Sylvia. Dennis said he was instantly Paul's slave, and they made love all night. When they woke up the next morning, Dennis claims he looked over at Paul and saw in him a composite of his sister, Sylvia, his brother, Olav, Jamie Foster, which was Nilsen's, love in the army, his one true love, and several other people. Dennis said Paul had, quote, all the attributes of each one somewhere in his delectable form, a dream come true. I wanted no one else and would have been content to be his servant in order to be wedded to him in bed and company all the days of my life, end quote. But it turned out Paul was a free spirit, a untethered soul who preferred the company of many men to just one. So that didn't last long, and Dennis Nilsen ended up feeling rejected because he can't possibly think, this isn't about me. It's just that Paul, he's kind of freewheeling out there. He likes to, go all over town, but he has to take it personal. He has to take it as a personal hit to his self-esteem. In early December of 1973, Dennis resigned from the police force, and for a little while he worked as a security guard. He found this work boring and repetitive, but he enjoyed the times he was scheduled overnight because sometimes he would be alone and it would be quiet and he could be left to his thoughts, a welcome escape from the constant activity of being a police officer. By Christmas, Dennis had moved into a single room at 9 Manstone Road off of Cricklewood. One night, he was scheduled to guard an exhibit of items that belonged to the Natural History Museum, and he was drawn to the big stuffed gorillas. So basically, he's a security guard, and he's supposed to sit in this warehouse and just make sure that no one steals anything from the warehouse. And this night, there was a bunch of stuff that was supposed to go to the museum, and it was just kind of waiting there before the people picked it up and put the stuff up for the exhibit. So Dennis Nilsen sees these big stuffed gorillas, real gorillas that have been stuffed, which is disgusting, but okay. So Dennis stood there for a while and he looked at them and his imagination ran wild. And he said, quote, I touched them, and the hair on the back of my head and neck began to bristle with fear as my imagination advanced. They looked fierce and very powerful. Yes, big, hairy, and powerful. My fear gave way to excitement and thoughts of the possibilities of a fantasy scenario entering my head. My heart was pounding faster, and I couldn't restrain the impulse to take off all of my clothes. End quote. So, long story short, Dennis Nilsen, completely naked, draped himself into the arms of a large gorilla like this. So the gorilla's like this, and Dennis Nilsen is laying over his arms. And then he threw himself into this fantasy where he imagined he was being carried off by this great big beast into the jungle where this large gorilla would do whatever the gorilla wanted with him. Dennis had not been occupying the room at 9 Manstone long before his landlady told him he could no longer have guests, as she was quite nosy and had witnessed him leading many young men in and out of his room quite often. So Dennis moved 10 minutes away to 80 Teignmouth Road in the summer of 1974. He also quit his job as a security guard, but when his money ran out, he paid a visit to the Department of Employment office, and he was surprised when, due to his Army experience, he was assigned a job right away as a clerical officer who would work for the employment office, helping others to find jobs. He was sent to the job center on Denmark Street in London, and this is where he was employed when he met David Gallichan outside the Champion pub in November of 1975. Nilsen had had other short relationships with men before. There had been a South African businessman, a magazine writer, an Australian actor, an airport security employee, a Japanese doctor. These are just what he claims, okay? These are the people he claims he had relationships with, but I don't know. Show me the receipts, Dennis. But Dennis claimed none of them would catch his heart. Quite like David Gallichan, or Twinkle, as Nilsen called him, saying, quote, "I called him Twinkle because he wasn't a very bright spark," end quote. He's saying that David Gallichan was stupid. He wasn't smart. So they met because Nilsen had seen David Gallichan being harassed by 2 men outside of a bar, so he intervened and he took David Gallichan home with him like a stray dog. Gallichan was a 20-year-old with no job, no home, and no ambition. He had pretty much survived this long by finding other people to attach to, and when that relationship ran its course, he moved on to the next. Nilsen said that David was a wanderer with no great sense of responsibility, and he needed a daddy figure to lean on. David was thin, he had dyed blonde hair, and the IQ of a 10-year-old, even though he was 20. He had just moved to London from Somerset, he was gay, unemployed, and he was living in a hostel or whatever semi-safe place he could find to lay his head at night. After spending their first night together, David and Dennis decided that they should move in together. And that same day, they rented a ground floor flat at 195 Melrose Avenue, which was supposed to have been furnished, but upon moving in, the 2 men found it to be completely empty. So Nilsen meets David, saves him from 2 men who are like bullying him outside the Champion pub, brings him home, they spend the night together, and the next day they're like, let's go apartment hunting. But together, Dennis and David created the closest thing to a home and a family that either of them really had ever had. There was a long garden at the back of the apartment building, and when they arrived to live in the building, it was overgrown and filled with garbage, the garden. So David and Dennis actually talked to the landlord, and they were like, hey, if we clean this garden up, can we use it? And the landlord was like, yeah, go crazy, have at it. So together, Dennis and David cleared out the garden. They planted apple and pear trees. They built a fence. They laid a little stone path. They even installed a little fish pond. It was really cute.
You're a big nincompoop. Oh, over here. Over here? Over here. Stand up.
How long do you think it'd take me to dig the garden?
Don't stand there with your hand on your hip like a big poof.
And they also, together, bought a border collie puppy that they named Bleep because apparently this was the noise she had made when she was a baby. She didn't bark, she bleeped.
Oh, where's my bloody tea then?
Well, tea? Oh, it is.
Ooh, ah! Bloody finger, you great pillock.
Dennis would go to work every day and pay the bills while David stayed at the apartment, cooking, cleaning, working on the garden at the back of the house, doing the housework. And for the first 6 months, Gallichan worked tirelessly to furnish and decorate the flat, and it seemed really like the perfect situation. This relationship would be the longest one that Dennis would ever have. And although he has tried many times to make it seem as if David Gallichan was just a warm body and not that important to him, his inevitable break with Gallichan is considered to be one of the main triggers for Nilsen's killing spree. It is reported, though, that Dennis Nilsen treated David Gallichan like dirt, constantly reminding him that he, Dennis, was the breadwinner and David should just be grateful that he had someone to pay for him to live. And spoiler alert, that's not a great dynamic for a relationship. Not at all.
I can't understand you. I ask you to start filming from the feet slowly up to the head. And you go sip a sip pan. Bloody hell, don't you ever watch movies? You must see thousands of movies. You must know what it's like. They're training chimpanzees at Cape Canaveral to operate a camera. Anybody can do it.
And that's what annoys me, really, about Dennis Nilsen, because he's always complaining, no one loves me, no one wants to stay with me, everyone hates me. Because when you do have somebody that's dedicated to you, when they're living with you and they've said, okay, I'm here to love you and be with you, you treat them like garbage. In April of 1976, Dennis suffered from some illness. He had trouble with his gallbladder, and for 2 months, he was a miserable prick, even worse than he usually was, and he verbally berated his boyfriend when the pain became unbearable. And Dennis Nilsen was a little bit of a baby bitch boy, so the pain became unbearable for him quite a bit.
Batteries had run out, that's why the camera went up the creek. Okay, fair enough. If you think you know how to use it, all you do is point it down and press a button. What are you doing switching the bloody thing on and off for? You'd never make a cameraman, you know. No. I'm not going to do anything pornographic. Harassed commuter. Harassed London tenant being screwed by the Department of Employment. London Transport. Big chain stores, supermarkets. Can you, cut there, let me think. Beer I cannot stand, I got it for free at the bottle party. No. Here's to you, Mrs. Robinson.
He's ready, Des.
Yeah, okay, come in a minute. I got to sign on.
Oh yeah, I'm going to sign on today. I'll sign on again.
Where's that bloody dog? It's been chewing my slippers again.
Here it is. Chewing your slippers, so give it.
I'll wring its bloody neck if I catch it again.
And as the relationship deteriorated, both men began bringing others back to their shared flat for sex. So it was kind of just this weird situation. And here's something that's interesting. Dennis actually, around this time, met a Swiss woman at a bar that he said was named Elizabeth. And he brought her home and they had sex. And he said he enjoyed having sex with her, which led him to believe that maybe he wasn't gay after all. Maybe he was bisexual. After 2 years, David Gallichan was like, I've had enough. He packed his bags and he walked out. But a later friend and sometimes roommate of Dennis Nilsen's named Martin Hunter Craig remembered that when he met Nilsen, he was playing an arcade game in Leicester Square. And Dennis Nilsen approached him to talk about the game, kind of be like, oh yeah, doing great, new high score, yay. Kind of just like chatting. And Martin Craig said that they became friends, but Dennis was always more interested in drinking than having sex. In fact, Martin kind of made it seem like Dennis couldn't even get it up, saying, quote, sexually, Des was inactive. He couldn't do nothing. He didn't know where to start. He didn't know how to perform sexually, end quote. So Des is something that Dennis's friends would call him, Des. And there's actually a TV show, I believe, on the BBC, and it's starring David Tennant, Doctor Who, great actor, who plays Dennis Nilsen. It's excellently done. Excellently, is that a word? And this was sort of brought up in some documentaries and some articles I read about Dennis Nilsen, where he sort of had two different identities, two different lives. He was Dennis, the killer, the mean guy, the scumbag, the guy who would just do anything to anyone. And then he was Des, who was the friendly guy, the coworker who was considerate, the friend who let you crash on his couch whenever you needed a place to stay. And he had sort of these two different worlds, and we will circle back to that theme. So Dennis's friend, Martin, he basically made it seem like although Dennis wanted to have sex, physically or mentally or both, he had trouble kind of reaching the finish line. But whenever Martin was in London, Dennis let him know that he had a place to stay, and eventually Martin came to see Dennis, who he called Des, as a brother and someone he respected. He said Dennis was a decent man, a good man, until he drank, and then it was like Jekyll and Hyde. Martin remembered one time when Dennis was drunk. Dennis asked Martin if he had ever taken a blood bath, and how much would Dennis have to pay Martin for Martin to take a blood bath? This is where the friendship ends for me. All right, this is where I'm like, thanks, I appreciate the use of your apartment for when I'm in town, but I'm a pass, else I'm probably going to wake up in a bloodbath, whatever that is. Does Dennis Nilsen mean a bath with just strictly blood? So to this question, Martin responded that Dennis should stop drinking because he didn't say horrible things like that when he wasn't drinking. Martin remembered also that Dennis seemed to still be hung up on David Gallichan. He talked about him often and he clearly missed him. In reality, though, I don't personally believe that Dennis Nilsen loved David Gallichan. I don't know why it took so long for me to say that word, loved David Gallichan. At least not in the way that you and I might understand love. I don't think Nilsen was capable of human love. Gallichan was a means to an end. Nilsen could feel superior to him. He knew he was smarter than him, and he enjoyed the fact that David relied on him for financial support. So Nilsen could feel superior to his boyfriend. He could abuse him and call him an idiot. He could treat him as poorly as he liked, but David would never leave because Nilsen was his meal ticket. But David did leave. And it was not the loss of this love that stabbed Dennis through the heart. It was the realization that even someone like David Gallichan, who had nothing going for him, would rather be out on the streets than stay with Dennis. Losing David, losing this small semblance of normalcy, losing the comfort and security of having someone to come home to each and every night, is sort of pushed Dennis Nilsen over the edge. So Dennis Nilsen killed a lot of people. He had a lot of victims. Unfortunately, a lot of them were not identified, but those who were identified and who have information out there about them, I'm going to tell you about them. And I can't tell you about every single one because some of them we don't even know who they are, which is so sad. But Nilsen's first victim was 14-year-old Stephen Holmes, who lived with his mother, Kathleen, and his father, Francis, and his sister, Deborah, in Hampstead. He'd been born in Ireland, but when he was a baby, his family had moved to North London. Stephen Holmes had what Nilsen craved, a loving, stable family life, an active social life. He was a happy teenager who had a lot of friends. He played football, he supported Liverpool, and he loved music, especially rock and roll, which is why on December 30th, 1978, Stephen was excited as he got ready to leave his home and attend a rock concert in central London. After the concert, Stephen decided to walk the 2 miles back to his house, happily loosening the red tie he had put on for the occasion, but the weather was frigid that night. So as Stephen passed the Cricklewood Arms pub, he ducked inside to seek temporary relief from the cold. At this same time, a heavily depressed Dennis Nilsen was drowning pint after pint at the very same establishment. Later, when the police asked Nilsen what had caused him to venture out into the merciless cold that night, he told them that loneliness is a long, unbearable pain. He went on to say, quote, "I felt that I had achieved nothing of importance or of help to anyone in my entire life. I would think that if I drank myself to death, my body would not be discovered until at least a week after, or longer. There was no one I could call upon for real help. I was becoming depressed and conditioned to the belief that I was impossible to live with. This feeling of despair reached its peak when I spent Christmas of 1978 alone with the mutt. I would find comfort in music and the bottle. I was in a fit of drunken desolation by the time New Year approached." End quote. So when 14-year-old Stephen walked into that pub, Dennis noticed him and struck up a conversation. And Dennis Nilsen convinced Stephen to come back with him to his flat. They didn't exchange names or ages or personal information. Nilsen didn't know where the boy had come from or if there was anyone out there who might be missing him. At his apartment, Nilsen served Stephen alcohol and got him drunk, turning up the fireplace in his room to make the temperature very hot and to lull the 14-year-old to sleep. And it didn't take long before Stephen climbed into bed and passed out, at which point Nilsen got undressed and climbed in beside him, just happy to have a smooth young body to snuggle with. His words, not mine, man. Don't shoot the messenger. When Dennis woke up a few hours later, he felt for the first time in a long time happy. But this happiness passed quickly when Dennis realized that when Stephen woke up, he would leave, just like all the others. Later, Dennis would recall the moment he made the decision to make sure that Stephen would not leave, that Stephen would never leave, saying, quote, "I remember thinking that I wanted him to stay with me over the new year, whether he wanted to or not." End quote. So Dennis grabbed Stephen's red tie off the floor, and he wrapped it around Stephen's neck. which caused the boy to wake up, begin to struggle, fighting against his attacker. Dennis recalled seeing that Stephen was a nail biter, so his nails didn't scratch at Dennis as he strangled him. Within a few minutes, Stephen was unconscious but still breathing, and Dennis claimed he knew that when Stephen woke up, it would mean trouble for him. Yeah, you choked him until he passed out, so yeah, probably not going to not get in trouble. So Dennis decided to drown him, feeling at this point it was all or nothing. Dennis Nilsen filled up a bucket at the sink and then brought the bucket over to Stephen's still unconscious body. He lifted his limp head and placed it into the full bucket. Because Stephen was unconscious, he didn't struggle, and within a minute or so, he was dead. Dennis said that afterwards, he looked at his handiwork and knew that he had become a killer, and he had done this to appease all his own troubles and stress. After the murder, it was time for what Nilsen called the cleansing ritual. He brought Stephen's body into the bathroom and spent a long time examining him inch by inch as he bathed the body. After this was done, the panic began to set in. Stephen had no identification on him, and Dennis didn't know if anyone had seen them together at the pub the night before, so he knew he had to hide him, which became an increasingly impossible task as rigor mortis set in. Dennis decided that the only place big enough to store a stiff body was under the floorboards of his rented room. At first, he toyed with the idea of cutting Stephen up, of dismembering him, but he could not bring himself to do it because he wanted Stephen to stay there with him for a while in one piece. So Stephen went under the floor. Dennis got rid of his clothes and his belongings. Because it was winter and the weather was cold, Dennis knew if he kept his room chilly enough, the process of decomposition would be slow, giving him more time with Stephen. Dennis would also go to the store and buy some clothes for Stephen's body to dress him in and then undress him during those times that he would bring him out from under the floorboards to play with. The first time Dennis brought Stephen out, he said his body showed no signs of decay. There was just a slight pink hue on his face and lips. But when the weather began to warm up several months later, Dennis knew he had to say goodbye to Stephen. And by this time, the body was decomposing, it was blackened, and it smelled terrible. Nilsen dismembered Stephen using an electric knife, like one you would use to carve a turkey, and then he burned his body parts in a fire that he set in his garden the following August. Stephen's body was under the floorboards of Dennis's flat for 7.5 months, during which time Dennis took him out, bathed him, talked to him, and did other things to him that we will not speak of. Once Stephen was out of Dennis's flat and the evidence was burned, Dennis began to feel as if nothing had happened. A few months later, in October of 1979, he met a young man in the lobby of the Regent Palace Hotel. This man's name was Andrew Ho, and Dennis was so taken with the sight of him that he invited him back to his flat in the middle of the day. Now, apparently, Andrew was short on cash, and he was willing to be Dennis's companion for the night in exchange for a sum of money. Dennis agreed, but told Andrew that he didn't want to have sex. What Dennis really wanted, which he failed to reveal to his new friend, was to kill Andrew, to repeat what he had done to Stephen Holmes. After getting into bed and getting undressed, Dennis proceeded to get on top of Andrew and wrap his hands around Andrew's neck, but he said Andrew struggled like a tiger and was able to grab a candlestick and knock Dennis on the back of the head with it. Yes! Yes, Andrew! Andrew was able to run away, and he did go to the police, who called Dennis 30 minutes later, but Dennis denied that it had happened. He said that Andrew had tried to rob him, and he'd fought back. And since Andrew Ho was a young Asian gay man who was known to sell sex for money, that's what he was doing in the lobby of the hotel, the police didn't have a hard time believing the older Army veteran who worked for the city and who had been a cop and was a good, upstanding citizen. You would think that this close call would deter Dennis Nilsen from attacking again, but it almost seems as if it had the opposite effect. He had killed once, and he'd gotten away with it. He'd attempted to kill again, and he'd gotten away with it. So 2 months later, on December 3rd, 1979, while Dennis was drinking at a bar in the West End of London, and a young man began a conversation with him, Dennis knew how this interaction was going to end. Kenneth Oakenden was a 23-year-old Canadian college student who was on a tour of England. As soon as Nilsen found out Kenneth was a tourist, he knew that he was also the perfect victim. So he volunteered to spend the day showing Kenneth the sights of London, and at the end of that day, Nilsen brought Kenneth back to his flat on Melrose Ave after they had stopped at a store to buy some whiskey. Also, they bought rum. Also, they bought beer. Now, you would have to imagine that after an afternoon of drinking several rounds at a bar and then wandering around London, Kenneth would have been a bit drunk and tired, and he was planning to fly back to Canada the very next morning. He had thought that they were just stopping at Nilsen's flat for a quick meal before going back out to drink some more, and then Kenneth would return to his hotel, the Central Hotel, and pack so he could be ready for his flight. But once inside the apartment, Dennis put on some music, poured the drinks, and the two sat and talked as if they had been friends forever. Dennis was enjoying himself very much. He really liked Kenneth, which is why he could not get rid of this nagging feeling that this happiness and peace he was feeling was only temporary, and Kenneth would be gone by the morning. As they were listening to music, sharing a set of headphones, Dennis knew he wanted Kenneth to stay, so he strangled him with the cord from the headphones. After Kenneth was dead, Dennis poured himself a drink and calmly placed the headphones back on his ears, listening to music for hours as he sipped and contemplated the scene in front of him. In his autobiography, Dennis said, quote, "I gazed and gazed at him, wondering on the great mystery of where he had gone and where he was now." End quote. So Nilsen began to talk to Kenneth, or in his description, he thought his thoughts to him. He didn't speak them out loud. That's what Nilsen said. Like, I was talking to him, but I was thinking it, and I figured he could hear me. Nilsen removed Kenneth's clothes, tossed him over his shoulder, and brought him to the bathroom for the cleansing ritual. He carefully bathed him in the bathtub and then placed the body under the covers of the bed, climbing in next to him and falling fast asleep. Dennis Nilsen slept beside Kenneth's corpse for the whole night, and when he woke, he noticed how much colder the body was than it had been the night before. Fancy that, Dennis Nilsen, with all your smarts and all your superiority. Yeah, that's what happens when you kill someone or when someone dies. Their heart stops beating, their blood stops being rushed around their body, and they get cold. Dennis Nilsen described the events of the next morning, saying, quote, "I got up and cleaned the mess. I ditched all his things. I put him in the cupboard when I went to work. That night, I checked him in the cupboard where he was doubled up, and he was rigid in that approximate position." End quote. The next day, Dennis bought a Polaroid camera. He then removed Kenneth from the cupboard and dressed him in a vest, pants, and socks. Dennis put makeup on Kenneth to hide his red, puffy skin, and then he took pictures of the body in various positions before going back to bed with it, if you catch my meaning. Dennis may not have been able to get it up with live men, but for dead men, oh, he could go all night. After all of this, Dennis wrapped Kenneth in a blanket and placed him under the floorboards of the flat, and over the next 5 months, he would remove the body several times so they could watch TV together, listen to music together, and talk. 2 weeks after murdering Kenneth, on December 14th, 1979, Nilsen organized his office Christmas party, and he cooked for 80 people. He had brought some of his music to the party, and someone popped one of his cassettes in, and when the music began playing, Dennis Nilsen froze. It was a classic rock tape, and it had been the same tape that he'd been listening to with Kenneth the night he murdered him. Later, Nilsen would tell the police that hearing the music hit him like a bomb of shock and grief, and he said, quote, "He was my friend. I liked him a lot. His music still haunted me. When I heard classical rock one night, I think I raised the floorboards and begged his forgiveness." End quote. I don't believe him. I don't believe him, by the way. And you don't understand why yet, but you will. You will soon. Dennis Nilsen's first two victims, Stephen Holmes and Kenneth Ockenden, would be different than the rest of the men he would go on to kill, and he most likely changed his MO after killing Kenneth because in the days following the murder, the local newspaper printed stories of how a Canadian tourist had disappeared, walked away from his hotel one afternoon, and never came back to check out or catch his flight back home or get his suitcase. After this, Dennis realized he needed to be a bit more careful when choosing his victims. They needed to fit a certain profile. Homeless, down on their luck, sex workers, drug addicts, people struggling with mental health issues, no family to miss them or to notice they were gone. Nilsen's future victims would share one or more of these characteristics. They were men on the fringes of society who didn't have money, who didn't have a place to call home, who didn't have much hope, and who would be grateful for a hot meal, a place to stay, or a few dollars in their pocket. This was true of Nilsen's next victim, 16-year-old Martin Duffy, whom Nilsen found sleeping in the Euston Station in May of 1980. Martin was from Birkenhead, where he lived with his parents and siblings, Hazel and Graham. He'd had a rough childhood. He'd gotten into trouble for stealing and doing drugs, and he'd run away before when he was 15. So when he ran away again in May of 1980, he had been attending a special school for maladjusted youth. He was seeing a psychiatrist on a regular basis, and things, they really did seem to be turning around for Martin when he began taking a cooking course. His father was so proud. He'd given Martin a set of chef's knives as a present, and Martin had even started seeing a young woman that he was emotionally invested in. But things went bad for Martin every time he found himself in London, where he would frequent gay clubs, become addicted to Valium, and stay away from home for days or weeks at a time. On May 13th, Martin packed his suitcase and his chef's knives and set off for London again, most likely feeling he would go on a week-long binge and return home as he always did. But his family never saw him again. When Dennis Nilsen came upon Martin in the train station that Martin had been calling his home, he offered the young man a warm and safe place to sleep that night, and Martin eagerly accepted. According to Nilsen, Martin only finished off 2 beers before crawling into bed, most likely grateful to have a soft pillow to lay his head on. What happened then is what Nilsen referred to as a quick, concentrated kill. Nilsen strangled Martin quickly, saying, quote, "I didn't see the act as killing Martin Duffy, but a necessary and compulsive act of removing his will and personality from his body, so that I could enjoy imbuing it with my own will and my own desires." End quote. It's almost worse. Back at the Duffy residence, Martin's family were starting to get worried. Martin had not checked in with any of his usual London contacts. They had no idea where he was. Each night before he went to bed, Martin's father would gaze at a picture of his son sitting on his bedside table, and he would ask, "Where are you, son?" After killing Martin and washing his body in the cleansing ritual, Nilsen talked to the dead body and told it that Martin's body was the youngest looking he had ever seen. Dennis used Martin's body as he wanted to and then stored him in the cupboard. Because this was May and not the middle of the winter, when Nilsen checked on the body a few days later, he found it to be bloated and decomposing, so he put him right under the floorboards. According to Martin Duffy's family, Dennis Nilsen went back to the train station and got Martin's suitcase, and then Nilsen began to use this case to bring his lunch to work. He also kept Martin's chef's knives, and he would later use them to take apart another one of his victims before they became rusted, and he threw them out as if they didn't mean anything. But to Martin, to his dad, to his family, those knives were a sign that Martin was turning his life around, that he was finally going to get away from drugs and alcohol and things that were going to do him harm and lead him to an eventual bad end. Martin's family didn't have a lot of money. These knives were expensive. It was a sacrifice for them financially, and they thought it was worth it to show him how proud they were of him. So before this point, there had been some space between Dennis Nilsen's murders. Sometimes there would be half a year or more, but now Nilsen was picking up his pace. It was almost like the more he got away with it, the more he wanted to do it and get away with it again. In August of 1980, Nilsen brought home a man named Douglas Stewart, whom he had met in the Golden Lion pub, which Dennis claimed was a gay bar. So he was surprised when Douglas came back home with him, only drank 1 beer, and then told Nilsen he had no plans to sleep with him. He was just going to go to sleep fully clothed in one of the armchairs because he wasn't gay. Now, this raised a red flag for Nilsen, who felt Stewart was going to wait for him to go to sleep and then rob him or hurt him. Now, Dennis Nilsen's worried that somebody he brought home is going to rob him or hurt him when he brought him to the house so that he could hurt him. It's just, come on. Now, Dennis claims that he got in bed and he pretended to sleep so that he could wait and see what his guest would do. But because he'd had so much alcohol, he knew he couldn't stay up forever. So according to him, after he laid there and pretended to be asleep for a couple minutes, he just decided, you know what, I'm going to just strangle Douglas Stewart. So I don't have to stay up anymore waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'm just going to kill this guy because I'm tired. And in his autobiography, he actually called this killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Dennis attacked, trying to strangle Stewart with his tie, but the other man was not asleep and he fought back, wrestling Dennis to the floor. Dennis pretended that he thought Stewart had attacked him and was robbing him, and chaos ensued. Stewart ran into the kitchen to get a knife. Dennis was able to talk Stewart down and they parted ways. But Stewart returned an hour later with the police, who Dennis eventually convinced that all was well. He told the cops that they'd both gotten drunk, gotten into a fight, and Dennis had kicked Stewart out. The police told Douglas Stewart that he could file an official complaint if he wanted to, but he never did. And Nilsen is introspective about this failed murder attempt. He said that if Stewart hadn't been so alert from his lack of alcohol, And if he hadn't been so in shape, he would have been cozily napping under the floorboards of Nilsen's flat. Nilsen also claimed that he may have exaggerated his fear of being robbed or attacked in order to justify what he really wanted to do, which was murder Douglas Stewart, for no good reason at all, just to feed the monster inside of him who was constantly screaming out for more. You think? We figured that out, Dennis Nilsen. But in my mind, there's some sort of like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, like alternate ending to this story where Nilsen was the one who fell asleep, and then Douglas Stewart actually did want to rob him, and he robs Nilsen, and then Nilsen wakes up, and Stewart kills him because he's like, I gotta take your stuff and go, and I can't have you stopping me from doing that, so you gotta go. And then none of the other people that died at Nilsen's hands afterward would have died. But in his autobiography, Dennis Nilsen said, quote, "Ultimately, I could have no excuse for my conduct, which was not a one-off, but was becoming habitually addictive. The ritual had become more important and compelling than all the circumstances surrounding it, and it formed a clearly defined path. It was a subconscious wish to fulfill and replicate conditions in my distant childhood when I had become so detached from close tactile relationships." End quote. He talks about this ritual, and as we see, Nilsen repeats many of the same steps and activities with his victims and his intended victims. And he wasn't the first or last serial killer to have such habits. According to the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law, ritual and signatures are fantasy-driven, repetitive crime scene behaviors. These behaviors have been found to be an outgrowth of the perpetrator's deviant sexual fantasies, so the murder as well as the repetitive acts are part of the offender's arousal pattern. These rituals are unnecessary for the perpetration of the murder and involved activity that exceeded what would actually cause death. So basically, someone like Dennis Nilsen is just extra, right? He's doing all of these things because he's driven to, but they aren't needed for the end goal of murder, if that is your end goal. Not every serial killer has engaged in these rituals, but many of the most infamous ones have, and they do this as a way to psych themselves up for the murder or calm themselves before or after the killing. Jeffrey Dahmer liked to watch movies before he went out hunting for a victim. Sometimes he would bring the victim home to watch a portion of the movie with him. His favorites were Return of the Jedi and the third Exorcist movie. Apparently, Jeffrey Dahmer was a big fan of Emperor Palpatine, and he would sometimes wear contacts to make his eyes look yellow, like the Emperor's. For Dennis Nilsen, his pre-murder ritual was closer to Ted Bundy's. Both of these men liked to be 3 sheets to the wind before picking their victims, and this was mainly to reduce their inhibitions. Bundy was also known to visit his victims at their dump sites after they were dead. He would apply makeup to their corpses before having sex with them. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, did the same, and as we now know, so did Dennis Nilsen. The failed murder attempts are actually what helped Nilsen screen his future victims. He would remember that in the future they needed to be drunk, and it would help if they weren't healthy and strong so that they couldn't fight back. Nilsen's next victim, 26-year-old William Sutherland, fit this profile. Sutherland was originally from Edinburgh, and he'd lived a rough life as a juvenile delinquent, eventually being incarcerated. William, or Billy as he was called, was a heavily tattooed man, and the fingers of his hands were marked with the words love on one hand and hate on the other. He'd left behind a girlfriend and a child in Scotland, and in London he was homeless, sleeping where he could, selling himself for money or a meal. Billy Sutherland was a mama's boy, though, and she was the one person he always kept in touch with. He was also a heavy drinker, though, which would bring him face to face with a demon hiding behind the mild-mannered facade of a government worker. Billy and Dennis hooked up at a pub near Piccadilly Circus, and the two ventured out on a bar crawl until Dennis told Billy he was tired of walking and wanted to call it a night. Dennis does not even mention Billy in his autobiography because, according to him, he doesn't even remember killing him. Dennis said he could only remember a few seconds of the strangulation, and when he woke up the next morning, he was lying next to a dead body. Billy Sutherland was murdered in August of 1980. The next month, Nilsen killed another man, an Irish laborer whose name Nilsen didn't know. All Dennis knew about this man was he had rough hands, he wore an old suit and jacket, and he was between the ages of 27 and 30. Again, the next month, October of 1980, Nilsen killed his 6th victim, a slender male prostitute of Filipino or Mexican descent between the ages of 20 and 30. Both these victims, whose names we still do not know, were targeted by Nilsen in pubs in his neighborhood. In November of 1980, Nilsen murdered a homeless man in his 20s who he had found sleeping in a doorway at the top of Charing Cross Road. The only thing Dennis remembered about this victim was that killing him had been as easy as taking candy away from a baby. His words. Nilsen's last victim in 1980 was a man he had met in the West End of London. Nilsen called him a long-haired hippie. Once again, that was all he could remember about him. His violence was picking up in pace and frequency, and he was targeting those who would not be missed. In January of 1981, Nilsen murdered a young man he met in the Golden Lion pub, described by Dennis as an 18-year-old blue-eyed Scot who wore a green tracksuit top and cross trainers. The next month, another man was murdered by Nilsen, and all he knew about his 10th victim was that he had originally been from Belfast, and he was in his early 20s. As far as we know, Nilsen did not kill again until April of 1981, but this man he met at a food stall in Leicester Square, and he lured him back to his flat with the promise of food and alcohol. Now, in mid-1981, Dennis Nilsen was having issues with his landlord at his Melrose Avenue flat. The landlord wanted to renovate the building, so Nilsen was asked to leave the property. In August, Nilsen prepared to move out, but he didn't do the things people typically do when they're moving. He didn't wipe out the refrigerator or patch holes in the wall. He pulled up several decomposing bodies from under his floorboards. Among these bodies were Nilsen's 4 unidentified victims, along with Kenneth Ockenden, Martin Duffy, and Billy Sutherland. Nilsen said the corpses were in varying states of decay, so cutting them up was a nasty, unpleasant task, which is why he had to consume an entire bottle of Bacardi rum during the process. He then set a large bonfire in the yard by the garden that his ex David Gallichan used to meticulously keep. Some neighbors saw Nilsen standing by this fire, staring into the growing flames, but they assumed he was burning garbage because he hid the smell with burning tires. Local children would even come running over when Nilsen was having a fire, and they would dance around the flames, laughing, thinking it was a fun game. Criminologist Professor David Wilson believed that Nilsen kept the corpses for so long because they were, in a way, trophies for him. Wilson disagrees with Brian Masters, the author who wrote the most well-known book on Dennis Nilsen called Killing for Company. Masters felt Nilsen kept the bodies for so long so he wouldn't be alone, going as far as to come home from work and talk to them about the things that had happened in his day. Professor Wilson believes this was a sign of something deeper and darker, the need for ultimate control and power. He said, quote, "Nilsen is so self-obsessed, so desperate for his opinion to be the only opinion that counts and matters, that he finds it easier to relate, to have a conversation with a dead young man who isn't capable of answering back," end quote. But just like living people, the corpses would eventually become an annoyance to Nilsen once they started to decompose and smell, and he couldn't use them anymore, and he couldn't bring other men to his flat because of the horrible smell. Nilsen himself was annoyed by the smell of these dead bodies, of the men he had killed, and the constant flies that the smell attracted. And he would have to use room freshener spray, like room spray, like perfume or something, at least twice a day. And he also placed deodorant sticks under the floorboards, trying to absorb some of the smell. Dennis Nilsen's last victim to be killed at his Melrose Avenue flat was 24-year-old Malcolm Barlow. Malcolm had been born in Sheffield, and he had spent most of his life in a mental hospital due to some developmental issues and epileptic fits. His parents had died, so he was an orphan, and he didn't really have a friend in the world. About Malcolm, author Brian Masters writes, quote, "He would do anything for money, including sleeping with other men and attempted blackmail. He would live in hostels or with anyone who'd pick him up off the street. Although of low intelligence, Malcolm Barlow understood the Social Security system like a professional and never missed a date to sign on for his unemployment benefits," end quote. On the morning of September 17th, Dennis Nilsen left his apartment at 7 a.m. to go to work, and he saw a man sleeping on the sidewalk outside. It was Malcolm. Nilsen asked him if he was all right, and Malcolm said that the medication he was taking for epilepsy made his legs weak, and he'd fallen down. So Dennis picked Malcolm up and brought him inside of his apartment and called for an ambulance, wanting the man to get some medical assistance. The next day, after he had been treated, Malcolm was released from the hospital, and he returned to sit on the pavement outside of Dennis Nilsen's flat. Talking so hard with my hands and my braid fell out. I don't even know where the hair tie one, so we're going to do one of those. Oh, that looks great. When Dennis saw Malcolm again, he told Malcolm that he was supposed to be in the hospital, to which Malcolm responded that he was all fixed up. So Dennis invited him inside for a cup of tea. Nilsen made dinner for the two of them, and they sat down to eat and watch television while Dennis enjoyed a drink. Malcolm asked for some alcohol as well, and at first Dennis said no because he didn't feel that Malcolm should be mixing pills and alcohol. Finally, he told Malcolm to have at it. And after 2 rum and cokes, Malcolm Barlow passed out on the couch. According to Dennis, he tried to wake him up, but the man wouldn't stir. And Dennis considered calling for an ambulance again, feeling annoyed that Malcolm had sort of like forced himself back into his life. But he didn't really. You invited him in and cooked for him. So you invited him into your life, actually. Dennis did not kill Malcolm because he wanted to have him with him forever. He said he killed him because he didn't want him there at all. He was a nuisance, and this was something that Nilsen's defense team would have a hard time explaining away later. With the others, some sort of psychological break or mental health issue may be used to explain away the motive. I mean, at least Nilsen's defense team would try that. But with Malcolm, it was just cold-blooded murder. It's been very hard for people to pinpoint what Dennis Nilsen's pattern was. It seemed sometimes he killed because he cared about the victims too much and he couldn't stand to lose them, and sometimes he killed because he didn't care at all. This makes finding an emotional trigger for these murders that happened in quick succession almost impossible. If a pattern is there, no one has been able to pinpoint it. Nilsen had sexual relations with at least 6 of his victims, but he did not with the other 9. Some of the murders he remembered in vivid detail, while others he had no recollection of besides waking up to find a body next to him. Dennis Nilsen would leave his flat, and he would begin occupying the building in Muswell Hill, where he would go on to murder 4 more people before being apprehended. And that is where we will pick up next time. Don't forget to like the video if you like it, share it if you think it's worth sharing, subscribe if you like these types of videos and more. We have a great community here. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter. It's just Stephanie Harlowe or Steph Harlowe. Everything's in the description box. And don't forget to check out my podcast, Crime Weekly, that I co-host with retired police detective Derek Levasseur. We have new episodes out every week, every Friday on audio platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and every Wednesday on our YouTube channel. Links to all of those are in the description as well. And the link to Surfshark is in the description. Take advantage of the special offer. Get yourself a VPN. Feel safe on the internet. Thank you guys so much for being here. Stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe. And I will see you for the conclusion of this series very soon. Bye.
Straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly. So you got to let it go. I got blood.